Sup bitches? I'm reliably informed that I'm terrible at pimping my stuff. So here I am, pimping my stuff in what's hopefully an amusing way. If you want to interact with me and follow me, you can find me on Twitter at Grinosaur and at Mort_post for official announcements. Hello lovelies, today we're looking at Princes of the Apocalypse for Dungeons & Dragons, continuing my current string of D&D reviews. Don't worry, we'll get to other stuff eventually, but there's a lot going on in the D&D sphere, and so doing these reviews also gives me a chance to comment on the direction of things and so on. I'm going to start this review by committing heresy.
Heresy! 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 Come on, baby, give me some heresy! What is heresy? How
I was never, ever a fan of what you might call Gygaxian dick dungeons. Ones that didn't really necessarily make any internal sense. That can be fine in and of itself. But the dick dungeon combines not making much, if any, sense with also just randomly killing characters. Puzzles without clues, problems that don't necessarily have solutions, issues where you can just die flat out from a single bad roll. Not that I'm saying going too far the other direction is necessarily good, nor am I saying that if a character does something fundamentally stupid, like stick their head in the guillotine and pull the handle, that they shouldn't die. I mean, obviously. Oh, excuse me. I've got to sneeze or cough every review. That's the rules. No, but it's just arbitrary random death has never really appealed. And this is designed as a sort of sequel, a larger, more grandiose examination of the Temple of Elemental Evil, which is one of the classic Gygaxian dick dungeons. Much like Tomb of Horrors is. Tomb of Horrors is probably the archetypical one, but the Temple of Elemental Evil is certainly up there. And that is one of the most dickish traditional dungeons. But this takes that idea and scales it up to a cosmic level threat. I've heard people describe 5th edition D&D as being a superhero game in fantasy costume. I've never really felt that way particularly about it. I just think it's a lower lethality, more comic booky, I would say, more action film sort of style game. But in this one, because they've taken that classic Gygaxian dick dungeon and turned it into a much bigger, more cosmic scale threat, that does make it feel kind of more superheroic, I suppose. And if you're looking for some more information on the Forgotten Realms, you get a reasonable amount of information here about the surrounding areas. But again, while this adds value to what is otherwise purely an adventure book, we really need a proper tome-like guide to the realms. Or if they're not up for that, why not bring back the old gazetteers? That's a format I've been using for Erotech to do like smaller zines that contain content as the world gets built as you go along, as areas get defined as you go along. Plus that would make reference a lot easier. So that might be an interesting approach for them to do, but they seem to be determined to make every release a hardback 200-page monstrosity, whether it's an adventure book, campaign book, source book, whatever. So in place of a single mega dungeon, a single Gygaxian dick dungeon, instead what you get is what most D&D adventures seem to be, which is largely a string of set-piece battles with short periods of exploration between them. And while the Gygaxian creativity was there in the original adventures, because everything was new back then, here this just feels like a retread of everything that Wizards has done in every adventure so far. The only thing that's really diverged from that morass of mediocrity is probably Rime of the Frost Maiden, which feels like something I would actually want to run at some point. Otherwise, I haven't been terribly impressed by the adventures, because it's sort of halfway between that 4th edition format where everything was a set-piece fight and it was extremely tactical, and maybe 3rd edition where you got into things a bit more technical, a bit more role-playing oriented. Somewhere between the two. It's not a sweet spot for me. It might suit you very well. It's not too complicated, not too difficult, but it is just a string of fights. Where this mini campaign shines, if it can be said to shine, is in its subset of dungeons. So instead of wings of a dungeon being devoted to different elements, in this, as things get scaled up and made bigger, as the stakes are raised, as they like to say in movies, you get entirely separate dungeons themed towards each of the corrupted elements. And that is where it shines, in that you get whole mini dungeons, I suppose, devoted to each of the corrupted elements, and those are all highly thematic, and they really do bring out the sense of that corrupted element. It lacks the force of the original, the deadliness. Now, I think the originals were too deadly, to the point where it became rather stupid, but 5th edition, anyway, it is really hard to kill a character, and hence it's really hard to create a genuine sense of threat, danger, imbalance, and for something steeped in so much history of being difficult and deadly and requiring you to be careful and tactical and observant as a player as well as a character, this just lacks that force, lacks that emphasis, lacks that danger, that sense that you're putting your life into your hands, which is something that I really find dogs my 5th edition game that I do run, Eretech, and where I have dabbled in standard D&D before. It's why I tend to house rule quite a lot. I mean, in Eretech, we've had situations where a character has been reduced below 0 hit points in a single blow, but they're not dead even then. And we have a mechanism by which the people who are really tuning in for the cam show can throw some tips at the screen to get a character out of trouble. Yeah, and obviously that's meant to be a more presented, put together cinematic campaign, but yeah, even without that, it is really difficult to kill a character in 5th edition. Not that you should be aiming for that in any case, but it should be a threat. It should be there. It is something that should happen, albeit rarely, and not necessarily at the player's bidding or decision. So for a game, for a dungeon, even though it doesn't use the name, it's riffing off it. For something that is known to be such a deadly Gygaxian dick dungeon, to not make the effort to try and kill at least one character, it just feels a bit off. Thematically, it's not honouring the original. And the overblown stakes don't really mean much if you don't find or feel the risk. And the scale of the cosmic level threat really feels more like it should be something in the background, rather than something that characters should necessarily be able to influence or fix in any way. I'd recommend using milestones rather than standard XP for most of these mini campaigns that Wizards has been putting out. Using milestones and handing out levels occasionally, just when it feels like you need to, just strikes me as a better way of dealing with leveling. I mean, let's face it, in every edition of D&D, the best time to be had while role-playing in that game, the best balance, the best sense of dread and danger and so on, is from levels 1 to 6. And once you get beyond that, beyond the sort of NPC elite level, thing that the wheels tend to come off reasonably quickly, and it becomes ever more difficult to really balance things. So that's the adventure. You deal with, obviously reviewing adventures, you don't want to give anything away too much, so that makes it hard, but you have to deal with each of the corrupted elements, chase the MacGuffin from one to the other, and then there's a final showdown. As ever, monsters, non-player characters, and magic items is probably the most useful part of the book. Some of these NPCs are fairly interesting visually, if nothing else. So there's certainly usable content here. And the cults of the corrupted elements can be used elsewhere as well. You have a good selection of NPCs and monsters. It's better. It's better, I would say, in having human or humanoid enemies that are more useful, more suitable to exactly the kind of campaign this isn't, which is one of intrigue and vying political forces and cults and so on. So that's usable elsewhere, nice and easily. So there's a lot of humanoid enemies, which I really do think it is good, and it's something that's welcome. It just doesn't necessarily fit the adventure here as written. It's much less about the intrigue and much more about a string of fights to solve each of the elemental issues. The cult is something that's more in the background for the most part. They do pop up here and there. So spending so much time on them, while welcome for use outside the adventure, isn't terribly useful for the adventure itself necessarily, because even the most detailed NPC pretty much is going to end up as sword fodder. So there you go. Elemental weapons is a nice touch if you're running a more elementally themed game or setting. You can easily blag these and import them into your own thing. We've got an in-depth examination of is it Genasi or Genasi? I never remember. But the elementally touched people, which is something you can easily expand on with other planar touches, such as the alignments and so on, though they're trying to de-emphasize those. You don't have to do that in your game. So there you go. We also have some new spells to do with the elements, which is always nice and welcome. I tend to be quite loose and flexible with what spells can and can't do. When I'm running D&D, it's a legacy of playing mage, I think. But if you're a more prescriptive GM or player, then having all of these defined spells, which you can again riff off to make up your own, nothing wrong with that. And it ends with some ideas on how to adjust this for other gaming worlds. Now, they don't seem to have any plan to release anything for Dark Sun, but they seem to acknowledge at least that people are still playing it, so that's something. And they go on through the various other aspects as well. I mean, that's probably as much Dark Sun content as you're going to get, unfortunately. But there you go. They also talk about Greyhawk, Eberron, which we do have a source book for, or your own world. How to adapt these things into there, which is fairly useful advice, though a bit specific to specific D&D realms. The generic advice is too generic to really be useful. The concept art's quite nice. I particularly like this giant walrus, so I want to point him out to you. Look, a giant walrus. But there you go. So, what do I think of it? It's yet another rather mediocre adventure with some additional content that's actually useful. In trying to be something different and more than the Temple of Elemental Evil, it loses the heart and soul of what the Temple of Elemental Evil was, which was a Gygaxian dick dungeon. Some people get off on difficulty, and that is why they play things like Dark Souls. And the old Gygaxian dick dungeons were I know this comparison is facile, but they're the Dark Souls of their day. Things people would share horror stories about, or pride that they'd managed to beat in some way, even if it was by cheating. But this isn't that. If you're looking for that experience, I think you're going to have to go to the old school Renaissance or Lamentations of the Flame Princess, and it's Rajian Dick dungeons, I guess. That kind of misery tourism to get that kind of experience, because you're not going to get it here. And yeah, it doesn't wear its influence on its sleeve, but it's still weighed down by it. In terms of style, I do like the stylistic dungeons for each of the elements. It's just let down by everything stringing it together, but I have to give them an A for effort because they're usually so mediocre. So I would give it a 3.5 out of 5 for style. And in terms of substance, I would also give it a 3.5 out of 5 for substance. So that's 7 out of 10, or 3.5 stars out of 5 overall, which is better than average. So this is one of the slightly better modules, but it just can't live up to its past. Zang.
Tal, friend, and welcome to Gor. Savage and beautiful, John Norman's Gorean saga is brought to life in the Tales of Gor role-playing game and its companion world book, World of Gor. Take flight on a tarn, luxuriate in the bathhouses of Ar, pit your steel against the deadly Kuri, best your enemies and place them in your collar. Tales of Gor uses the D6 system, perfect for both new and old players. You can purchase it from Amazon, RPG Now, or lulu.com. Ta Sada Gor.